Alright guys, so here's the question category chart for practice exam 2. And we will be covering adverb adjectives, other verb usages, and dangling or misplaced modifiers for this exam. By the way, if you haven't been doing so, please download the Excel version of this chart for each exam that you do, so that you know which question types you're having most trouble with. Okay, so let's first take a look at adverb adjective questions. These questions will usually have underlined portions that contain either descriptive words and a noun, like number 19, or just descriptive words like numbers 1 and 7. But if the noun is not part of the underline, like numbers 1 and 7, you can see that there is one or two adjectives between the underlined portion and the noun that appears shortly after the underline. For instance, in number 1, the adjective earnings is between the underlined word comparing and the noun that follows data. And similarly, in number 7, the adjectives computer and engineering are between the underlined words relative high paying and the noun that follows shortly after, fields. Now the correct answer is usually going to be an adjective noun structure or adverb adjective noun structure. This is simply because it is very common for adverbs to structurally precede adjectives and for adjectives to structurally precede nouns. Since all these questions contain nouns shortly after or towards the end of the underlined portions, we should anticipate an answer choice that places adjectives and or adverbs before these nouns. Additionally, in general, adjectives and adverbs more concisely modify nouns than prepositions or dependent clauses do, so if an answer choice offers it, it is usually the correct answer, as you can see that the answers for all three questions of this type in this exam contained an adjective plus noun or adverb adjective plus noun format. Now going on to other verb usages, namely present and past participle questions. First thing we recognize is that the underlined portion will contain a present or past participle. Remember, you must be able to distinguish between verbs and participle clauses. Verbs are actions that nouns do, while participles are used for modification purposes. A past participle is an ed form of a verb that modifies the preceding noun or pronoun, like in number 36. And a present participle is an ing form of a verb that modifies the preceding noun or pronoun, like in number 2. Now this is very important. If the corrected sentence already has a verb, the correct answer, as we see in both answers for number 2 and 36, are often the choice that contains a present participle if the noun does the action. And as expected, because women do the working and people do the fearing, the correct answers for both numbers 2 and 36 contain present participles. An exception to a present participle phrase that doesn't imply that the noun does the action is when a be verb is used. For instance, window being built. Window doesn't do the being verb. It actually receives the being verb. Being is a present participle form, but it doesn't connect the preceding noun to be the performer of the action simply because it is not an action verb. It is a be verb, and therefore only action verb present participles connect the preceding noun as the performer of the action. Past participles are also commonly used to modify a noun when the sentence already has a verb. Past participle phrases are appropriate when the noun receives an action from the execution of the verb. Examples of appropriate past participle phrases are cup filled with water and feathers collected by scientists. Past participles are appropriate here because a cup is filled by someone and therefore receives the action. In other words, the cup doesn't do the filling action. Also, feathers receive the action because feathers are collected by someone. The feathers don't do the collecting action. However, if the corrected sentence lacks a verb, you must select the answer choice that provides a verb to the sentence, like choice D in number 8. Notice that choice A, coming, is a present participle because ing verbs without a linking verb like am, is, or are cannot function as verbs. They are either gerunds, which are nouns, or present participles. And many participle questions will not even contain an adjective plus noun choice, but sometimes, when an adjective plus noun structure is offered as one of the choices, and the participle is followed by a noun modifying prepositional phrase, you can effectively turn the participle into an adjective. And when you can do this effectively, you have to give priority to the adjective noun structure, because as I mentioned in the adjective adverb question type template, the adjective plus noun structure is the most concise modifying structure. But first, some conditions must be true for you to effectively turn noun plus participle structures into adjective plus noun structures. Let's first consider an example for present participles. Child crying in the library. The prepositional phrase in the library modifies the noun child, and therefore, because there's a noun modifying prepositional phrase after the participle, we can move the participle before the noun to make it an adjective. And crying child in the library works very well. Moving the participle before the noun moves the noun closer to the prepositional phrase that modifies it, and that's why it's a better structure. However, for example B, walking past a van does have a prepositional phrase after the participle, namely past the van, but it modifies walking, not the noun child. Therefore, we cannot effectively move the participle into adjective format, because doing so just gets the word walking farther from the prepositional phrase past the van that modifies it. Now let's consider an example for past participles, but the same rules apply. Students rewarded in college contains a noun modifying prepositional phrase in college, which modifies the noun students. Therefore, moving the participle before the noun works well. In the adjusted clause, rewarded students in college, students is closer to the prepositional phrase that modifies it, namely, in college. Other times, as you saw for present participle example B above, the prepositional phrase that follows the past participle modifies the past participle and not the noun. Consider example D. Students rewarded for excellence. The prepositional phrase for excellence modifies the past participle rewarded, not the noun students. And similar to the case for present participles, you cannot effectively move the participle to precede the noun, because doing so will just move rewarded farther away from the prepositional phrase that modifies it, namely, for excellence. So in summary, in order to effectively restructure participles into adjectives, there must be a noun modifying prepositional phrase directly after the participle. If there is one, you will most likely have one answer choice in the adjective plus noun plus prepositional phrase format, which is preferred because they are more concise than noun plus participle structures. But as you see for both questions in this exam, numbers 2 and 36, there is no noun modifying prepositional phrase, let alone any prepositional phrase at all. so we can just select the noun participle structures depending on whether the noun does or receives the participle verb. You only have to take this exception into account when a participle is in between a noun and the noun modifying prepositional phrase. Now moving on to dangling and misplaced modifier questions. Unfortunately, these questions are difficult to generalize a recognition pattern for because they appear in so many variety of sentence structures. You have to think about the modifying phrase and think about whether it logically modifies the preceding word or not. With that said, we did cover all three variations of modifier question types in this exam, and there are two forms of questions for misplaced modifiers. The type that you can correct by just repositioning commas and the type you can't just reposition commas for. Usually the misplaced non-restrictive phrases that appear in the middle of sentences, which are phrases that are wrapped by commas to begin and end the phrase, these are usually corrected by simply repositioning commas. So let's look at number 26. We're going to check if comma repositioning alone can correct the mistake. We move this comma here one word left and reread the phrase, celebrated for his wealth and profuse expenditure, to see if it logically modifies Lucullus. And it does. Lucullus is celebrated for his wealth and profuse expenditure. And look, it's exactly choice C. We don't need to execute the rest of this template by moving the comma 2 or 3 words left and right because we already found the answer. But sometimes you will have to move the comma 2 or 3 words left and right to make sure that comma repositioning is not the solution. Now, the second type of misplaced modifier question usually appears towards the end of sentences. For instance, number 24. We try moving this comma here up to 3 words to the left, but the new phrase doesn't logically modify is, eating, or of. And on the right side, we try moving the comma here, here, and here. But the new phrase again doesn't logically modify extensive to and all. Therefore, we must just insert a conjunction before the original sentence to introduce a new dependent clause, which only choice C does. Now, I want to talk about another type of misplaced modifier question, but this type doesn't have the modifier underlined, and therefore it fixes the modifier and requires you to change the portion preceding the fixed modifier. As you see in this example, you will most likely be required to reword the preceding portion in a way that the last word of the reworded choice becomes the noun modified by the fixed modifier. For instance, biofuel must be the last word of the underlined portion because no other word in the underlined portion is capable of being described as fuels derived from once living material. And unsurprisingly, the answer to this question was the only choice that had biofuels as the last word, since biofuels are the only thing that can be fuels. And this is how you save time in these questions. You focus on selecting a choice that has the appropriate last word so that the fixed modifier can logically refer to it as the preceding word. Now, dangling modifiers are basically misplaced modifiers that appear in the beginning of sentences, also known as introductory phrases. So you ask yourself, who was doing the verb in the introductory phrase? If your answer to that question equals the noun that follows the introductory phrase, comma, it is not a dangling modifier. But if your answer does not equal the noun that follows the comma, change the introductory clause or the noun after the comma so that the noun doing the verb in the introductory phrase equals the noun that follows the comma. Let's look at number 27. Telling his servants which hall he was to sup in, they knew. So we ask the question, who was telling his servants? Your answer is Lucullus, or he was telling his servants. But the noun after the comma equals they. So answer, which is he or Lucullus, does not equal they, and therefore we have a dangling modifier. Your fix must make the introductory clause subject and the noun after the comma equal to each other. So let's check this fix. When his servants were told which hall he was to sup in, they knew. So for this new introductory clause, we ask the question, who were told? And your answer is, his servants were told. And the noun after the comma equals they, his servants are they, and choice B is the only choice that changes the introductory clause because they or his servants were told. Since we just did a present participle introductory phrase, let's do an example of a past participle introductory phrase. Bothered by the homework policy, the teacher complained. You ask, who was bothered? And your answer is, I was bothered. But the noun after the comma is the teacher. So your answer, which was I, does not equal the teacher, and we have a dangling modifier. Now some questions will have you change the noun after the comma instead of the entire introductory phrase, but as long as one is changed to equal the other, it's fine. Now let's look at the fix. Bothered by the homework policy, I complained. And you ask again, who was bothered? And your answer is, I was bothered. But now the noun after the comma is I, so your answer, which was I was bothered, equals the noun after the comma, I, and the sentence is corrected. So in summary, the subject doing the introductory clause verb must be equal to the noun that follows the introductory clause, comma. If they don't equal, change either the introductory clause or phrase or the noun after the comma to equal the other. Now, sometimes there is no verb in the introductory phrase. Consider this example. Palette in hand, he squatted down to paint. You can't ask, who was palette in hand, as we've been doing for present and past participle introductory clauses, but you can ask, who had the palette in hand? So whether there is a verb or not, the point is that the introductory phrase has to focus on the same noun as the noun after the comma. Since he is the one who had the palette in hand, this is not a dangling modifier.